The Last of Us is an iconic video game series, and that's only become more true thanks to the HBO show that has started airing. In fact, handing off the license to make a show from the creators of Game of Thrones was an amazing idea. But because of the show's plot, it's leaving lots of people asking, how realistic is it really? Let's break down the show's story, fungal infection, and general ideas and see which parts are realistic and which are fungal fever dreams. We will be pulling info from both the game and the series. So let's start with the biggest thing to tackle, and that's the virus in and of itself. In the show, cordyceps is one of the fungi referenced in the first episode as a potential threat, and is the virus we know is responsible throughout the show. Now, it's never stated which kind of cordyceps they're dealing with, or even if it's a variant we're aware of. However, it is safe to say that cordyceps is a very real fungus, and while as of current it can't affect humans, it would be a pretty easy leap in logic for a fictional show, as we see. According to the events of The Last of Us, what ended up happening to cordyceps is that the fungus mutated due to a warming globe so that it could survive in a human body. This is pretty clearly laid out in the beginning of the first episode, and while it's never directly said that this is the cause, it's a pretty obvious assumption.
For instance, the world were to get slightly warmer.
Now, let's make something very clear. Mutation and evolution are things that do happen in fungi. However, fungus mutation is a very slow process compared to things like viruses or bacteria. And we haven't seen very many fungi adapt to affect humans, and especially not cordyceps. In fact, mycologist Matthew Kaysen said in an interview based on the show that the evolution needed to jump to humans would take millions of years, especially considering how far apart humans are from ants. Similarly, mycologist João Araujo, in an interview with New Rockstars, echoes this and says this is highly unlikely. Now, this is sort of a two-pronged question, because as we mentioned prior, cordyceps has never made the jump from insect to primate. In fact, it seems content to stick to insect populations. So no, the exact fungus we see in The Last of Us has never popped up in humans as far as we can tell. However, other fungi have evolved to infect humans. In fact, according to the Center for Disease Control, there are at least 16 major diseases caused by fungi, ranging from simple ones like yeast infections or ringworm, to more deadly ones like the invasive candidiasis caused by the fungus Candida. With so many fungal infections being relatively common, it's safe to say fungus can affect humans, but none as deadly or specific as the cordyceps we see in the show. During the events of the second and third episode, it's revealed that the way the fungus initially spread was due to somehow getting into the flower supply and affecting the food supply as such.
It's gonna make you birthday pancakes. I swear.
You know, I don't really like pancakes.
In the aforementioned interview with mycologist Matthew Kaysen, he mentions two different specific situations. Firstly, he mentions more general fungi that get into the food supply that can make people very sick. But those fungi aren't usually contagious and obviously don't have the same effect as the cordyceps. He also mentions a more specific situation where a fungus called ergot could get into rye grains and cause those that consume it to start hallucinating. Now, the aforementioned mycologist João Araujo says that flour seems to be too dry for most fungus. Although, considering what else we know, this may be a cordyceps-specific issue, though he does mention that a humid location would be necessary, and according to weatherspark.com, average humidity in Jakarta during the months of 2003, when the show seemingly starts from, were lower than usual but still oppressive, which should be enough from what we can tell. However, while fungus can very easily get into the food supply, which does answer our question in the positive, the fungus that affects the food supply like this aren't nearly as contagious as cordyceps, and aren't really contagious at all from what we can tell. During the events of the second episode, we witness a colony of infected in the city reacting to sunlight and mostly staying still. This is because they are all connected by thin fibrous material in the soil that activates and sends a horde your way when the fungus senses danger, at least from what we can tell.
Now they know where you are, now they come.
Now this goes two ways, because yes, there is a giant fungal hive mine called the mycelium, and this does affect a lot of fungus in the real world regularly. It seemingly reacts to pain and is often called the giant fungal internet. However, mycologist João Araújo in the new Rockstar's interview says this is, quote, entirely fictional, at least in the way of cordyceps, which changes behavior in ants to be more social, but tends not to form a colony of this style. Now, the interview with writer and showrunner Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin show that this idea was rooted in some science, but was a mostly creative decision, which of course tends to be an unrealistic thing. So long story short, while a hive mind like this is possible and real, it's not particularly realistic for cordyceps. This is a subject that's been up to a lot of debate since the change was announced. In the show, the virus is shown to spread through a multitude of tendrils, both in the ground, in the mycelium, and also through the internal tendrils that seek out non-infected humans like we see during episode 2. In an interview with Variety, Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin talked about how this came about. And while there's not a lot of science behind the choice, it seems to have come down to personal preference. However, something mentioned did spark our interest. Spores, at least the ones shown in the game, wouldn't stay enclosed in one space. As according to a research paper published on PNAS, some spores can last anywhere from 60 minutes to over a week of time, most often only disappearing thanks to direct sunlight. This explains why the only places we see the spores are abandoned buildings or underground. Now, from the research we've looked into, it doesn't seem like spores travel very far due to their small stature. And one research paper says that they can go about as far as 30 centimeters or about 1 foot. Some studies seem to suggest that they can go further, but we couldn't find a consistent number from a reputable journal. Regardless, while spores and tendrils are both realistic in their own ways, neither of them really stand out as a better option. Now, this is the weirdest question we have to answer, because there's really no science to determine the answer to this. So, cordyceps as we see it in the real world does something similar to the armored plates of the clicker. However, what that really means is the cordyceps burst out of the head like a fungal tree to spread even more spores across the land. Now, this is taken through the science fiction ringer and made into the intensive armored plates that cover the head of the clicker and then the whole body of the bloater. Now, as far as we can tell, there are no armored plates that form when infected with cordyceps. However, this can be explained because of a mix of mutation and the amount of time spent. In the ants it affects, it usually explodes within a couple of weeks at most. Meanwhile, in the universe of The Last of Us, we hear tales of infected living for decades, possibly even longer, depending on if the infection were to continue into the future. So while mutations are likely over that period of time, we can't say for 100% certain. This is a very intriguing question, so we'll be tackling a couple of different things when we talk about this. So first, let's tackle what the show itself says. As of writing, no real mentions of a cure have been around. Although, in the second episode, the mycologist seems to think that there is no possible cure outside of a literal bomb being dropped upon infected cities. Yet, the game seems to heavily imply a cure was possible, as Jerry Anderson apparently had the ability to create a cure thanks to Ellie's immunity. If one is to believe the chaps over at Game Theory, vaccines would be theoretically possible, but not in the way depicted by the game.
There is zero moral quandary here.
Especially considering how the Fireflies intended to kill Ellie to obtain her infected brain so they can form a cure. He also shows a clip from a mycologist who mentions that there are currently no vaccines or immunotherapies for fungi, and that they're very hard to make. Now, this mostly rules out a vaccine. However, going back to mycologist Matthew Cason, he does mention that antifungal sprays or other such things may be able to fight off something like the cordyceps we see, or at least might be worth a shot. Now, we're not sure where the show is going with this, as maybe there is more info to be had on a potential cure. Now, this is referring to one of the saddest scenes in episode 5. After Sam reveals that he had been infected, Ellie tries to cure him by cutting open her hand and letting the blood from the wound get into Sam's bite. Now, the logic here makes some sort of sense, as there are a lot of things that can be fixed with a blood transfusion. Although, the way Ellie decides to do it would not lead to any real results, which is sadly shown in the episode. She places her blood against the wound with no way to know if the blood would enter his bloodstream or affect him at all. Now, according to the CDC, there are fungi that infect the bloodstream like Candida. However, according to our research, ants, which cordyceps usually infect, don't have blood, instead having something called hemolymph. While it's similar to blood, it is so drastically different that there is no way to compare the two. So, while there are fungi that affect the blood, everything we've seen about the infection in the Last of Us TV show points to the fact that despite her immunity, Ellie's blood transfusion wouldn't work the way she does it. Now, there are diseases that work via the bloodstream, and there are cures that can be administered via blood as well. However, when those cures are administered, it's via injection, so there is a chance that her idea could work on that basis. It is worth noting that it likely doesn't work in the case of cordyceps.
You're safe.
So after all of that, we've come to a lot of interesting conclusions. While a lot of the show uses real science as a basis and focuses on real fungi, not all of it tracks. The Last of Us falls into a lot of science fiction and zombie story tropes, and as such, sometimes fiction overtakes science. However, with how much the show gets right, it's hard to say it's not realistic. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more videos just like this.